Hello and welcome to the 8th instalment of the Stoics. So this week we're going to look at the French essayist Michel de Montaigne. Now it'll be interesting to see what you make of this week. Montaigne is known for his style, for his brilliant contributions for understanding the self and subjectivity throughout human history, throughout human culture, we might say. But how does he fit into the problems of Stoicism that we've been exploring on this course? How does he meet and respond to the problems of transience, fate, training, disposition? In Montaigne, we're going to encounter a lot which resonates with Stoicism, but like with the Dhammapada or like with Ecclesiastes, what we'll see in Montaigne is someone who kind of resists processes of Stoic thinking as well. He sees himself as a skeptic. And yet at the same time, just as he is skeptical about what human philosophers, what human beings have believed about the world and nature in the past, we'll get at the same time a consistent emphasis on the importance of the understanding. And the understanding is a means of training oneself, of developing self-understanding. And in that, there is something that is quite Stoic happening here. And Montaigne will be seen by his contemporaries as kind of like a Stoic. So over the next hour or so, you'll meet Montaigne, and then we'll think about this essay of experience, to what extent it contributes or resonates to Stoic ideas. It's also just a great essay anyway. All right, so this is the agenda. So we're going to meet Montaigne first of all. Then I'm gonna cover a little bit on Montaigne's context, because we are skipping ahead in time, aren't we? You know, our last class was in the 3rd to 5th century BC, so now we're in the 16th century in France. So what does that mean? I wanted to tell you a little bit about what's happening with Stoic philosophy and Stoicism in early modern Europe. There's a figure that you just need to know about, Justus Lipsius. So there'll be a little bit on him. Then we're going to get into Montaigne's essay of experience. We'll talk a bit about that. There's enough essay by Montaigne that I also want to mention here. And then in the final part, we're going to make some comparisons, I suppose, with Shakespeare and with the play Hamlet. This won't be, I'm not going to dwell on this massively, but I think that we'll be able to make something of this, I hope, when we meet and discuss things on Zoom. Right, okay, so let's begin by meeting Michel de Montaigne. Now, some of you may have encountered Montaigne before. Here, like selections of his essays, they're often striking for the irreverent, very personal, and seemingly quite modern way that he writes about himself and about his life and his world. So it's going to be a challenge for us over the next hour or so to kind of read Montaigne in his time, to read Montaigne so that he isn't immediately one of us, but to also kind of draw out of his thinking concerns, ideas, processes, forms of exercise that speak to us now, if that makes sense. So Montaigne, his years, he's born in the year 1533 and he dies in the year 1592. I'll tell you a little bit about his childhood in a moment. It's quite curious. He had a motto. His motto was "Que sais-je?" What do I know? And we see the you should be able to see, I hope, the scales there, the balance, suspending judgment. Being aware of different competing claims to the truth and not being too caught up or persuaded by one over the other. Now, Montaigne is going to make the case for a kind of Christian skepticism, Christian Pyrrhonism. We'll talk about this more in a bit. And there's some really interesting contextual reasons for this. Here's another portrait of Montaigne, slightly later in life. This is when he is 44 or 45. So he's associated with the region of Gascony, the city of Bordeaux in particular. He's born just to the east of Bordeaux. His father was a wealthy merchant, Pierre, I think involved in fruit or wine or something. His mother was, by descent from a Jewish Marano family. Now, Montaigne's life kind of spans most of the 16th century. He dies in 1592. All of his family are raised Catholic, but, and this is something that reflects what's happening in France more widely, some of his siblings become Protestant, Huguenot, but Montaigne does not. Montaigne will make these arguments about being sceptical and withholding judgment as a way of kind of responding to the drive for Reformation and for the ways in which this was dividing families, in his case, across France. Here is another image of Montaigne. So Montaigne seems to have had a happy, idyllic, if somewhat unusual childhood. He describes his father as the best father that ever was. So he's born in 1533, and in his first 3 years of his life, his father sends him to live with a local peasant family. And this is in order to cultivate a natural devotion to, quote, that class of men that needs our help. He mentions this in the essay Off Experience much later. But that's just, and his father's very interested in the ideas of humanism. You're wondering, what is humanism? It is this kind of flourishing of interest in the classical humanities and in learning, which kind of begins, I guess, across the 16th century. There are some contextual reasons. There's a lot of rediscovery of Greek philosophical texts. But there's this kind of wider emphasis on the new forms of education and study in human culture that are broad. You know, when we think of being a Renaissance man, of having a wide range of knowledge, this is something that we would get from the humanist canon, the humanist approach. So Montaigne has these early years with peasants, but then, this is an even more memorable thing, he's then educated solely in Latin. So his father wants him to kind of speak and understand Latin before French, and he's only able to understand French, or his dialect, the French Gascon, from the age of 6. In order to stop him from getting bored while he was studying, music would often play in the house. Montaigne, is the eldest son, by the way, would awake to hear music every morning. At the age of 6, he is sent to the Collège de Guyenne at Bordeaux, and he's instructed by a prominent humanist, a Scottish guy called George Buchanan. But then career-wise, he ends up kind of going into law and then politics. He studies law at the University of Toulouse. He then becomes a councillor in the Bordeaux Parliament in 1557, so at the age of 24. For a period of time, he's a courtier to Charles IX, the King of France, and he has these kind of royal links, you know, at different points throughout his life. He also mentions in the essays about his experience of being a soldier, and this is we'll come to this in a moment, the wars of religion that do divide up France, and wars that are just taking place throughout this period. At the age of 32, he marries, and he also talks about marriage quite candidly in the essays to Francois de la Chassagne. My French pronunciation is awful. He has 6 children. And then an important event happens to him in the year 1568. So he's aged, 35? 35? Yeah, 35. When his father dies. He's very close to his father. And this kind of leads to a period of soul searching, and a period of study as well. His father had requested that he edit a certain publication. The essays of Raymond Sebond, who produced a work called Natural Theology, and his father had kind of said to him, please can you translate this from Latin into French? And so Montaigne kind of does this translation. We'll talk more about Raymond Sebond a bit later. But this, while he's kind of grieving in his late 30s and doing this studious work, he seems to kind of decide to change his life in some way, because in the year 1571, age 38, he decides that he's going to retire. He's going to retire to his chateau. He receives the Order of Saint-Michel, which is the highest honour in the French nobility. And then from the year 1571 onwards, pretty much for the next 20 years, for the rest of his life, he's kind of, apart from a period where he goes travelling, he spends time reading essays in his tower, reflecting on his life, on his experiences, and then writing down the fruits of this experience, this reflection, which become the essays of Michel de Montaigne. A couple of other events happened while this is taking place. In 1580, this is when the first 2 volumes of his essays are published. And then he kind of travels to Paris to give a copy to the king. And then he kind of goes on, he travels through Germany and Italy. The essays are successful in his life. They are republished, and when they are republished, he ends up kind of making edits to them as he goes along, and he changes bits and has to cut bits out. Because of their success, his political career kind of revives again accidentally. He is asked to become the mayor of Bordeaux in 1581, which he does for about 4 years, I think. But he kind of wants to be away from the hurly-burly, and he wants to get back to his tower and study. And so in 1588, a more substantial collection of the essays appears. 1592, he dies. This is his castle, the Chateau de Montaigne, and it's a beautiful place. You can visit it there. This is enough one. This is from TripAdvisor, so it looks even better. And this is the particular tower in which he studied. Again, you can visit the tower, the place where Montaigne read and worked. And he often refers to the quotations that he has had inscribed on the beams above him from different places. We can see Greek, Latin. The Book of Ecclesiastes was important to Montaigne. I believe he had it inscribed in a few places. But que sais-je, what do I know? That skeptical point of self-examination, self-interrogation is key with him. Now let's talk a bit about the essays. So what you can see in front of you is from, I think it's from the first edition, 1580. And this is from a later one. Again, this is after he's died. Absolutely beautiful books from this period. So what does it mean to write an essay? Well, you probably might have kind of painful flashbacks of being at school or university. Montaigne kind of pioneers the essay form, although he's very influenced by Roman writers like Plutarch. The essays are called essays. And what does it mean to essay? The French word essayer it kind of refers to attempts, to tries. We could say to exercise. I think I'm kind of tempted to propose that we rename the essays the exercises, because you'll be immediately thinking of Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus. These exercises, these attempts at self-interrogation, the ways in which with Montaigne's essays they're often frequently interspersed with quotes from usually Latin authors as a kind of means of kind of remembering and questioning and examining and exploring his life. And the interrogation part is important because Montaigne is very open about his flaws and his faults in a way which seems really striking, really modern, really unusual. Of the essays, there are 107, and he writes, about really quite very highly varied topics. This is from the Florio translation of the essays, which was a very early translation of them from French into English. And this is sometimes kind of mined into when scholars are wondering, did this stuff influence Shakespeare? We'll talk about this a bit later. But if you kind of pore over this, you can see the topics are broad, but they're very everyday, aren't they? Idleness and liars, fear, friendship, prayers, age, siege, solitude, cannibals, we'll talk about that, drunkenness, cruelty. And then you see here, remember there's 3 books of the essays. The third book is written at the end, and these essays are significantly longer than the earlier ones. There's less of them. And the one that we'll focus on later is Of Experience, which is designed to be the end of the essays. It's the end of the essaying, the end of the exercises. And we can see the irreverent topics in places, thumbs, lies, coaches, and then some that are more that reflect that classical Latin-speaking humanist education, an interest in Greek philosophy, Democritus and Heraclitus. Seneca is frequently quoted in the essays. Cicero is another important influence. You might have noticed too, Enoch experienced the not just the irreverent topics, but the kind of things that end up being covered. You know, Montaigne isn't shy to talk about his own bodily functions like farting and excretion and so on. What are these essays meant to be achieving apart from just being assaying or attempts? Well, according to a scholar, Zed Schiffman, the essays should be seen as like arguments, basically. He says, quote, "For Montaigne, an essay was basically an argument undertaken for its own sake, not to establish rules of conduct, but to portray the workings of a unique mind." I think we see a lot of that here. But not just portray, to argue for. I think there's a lot in Montaigne that's trying to make the case for the way that he thinks, as much in the way that and in the way that he lives. It's not just a reflection, there's a kind of celebration of himself, nor necessarily in what we would nowadays call an egotistical way. This is somebody who sees himself as a part of wider nature, as a specimen of nature, who should be studied like any other thing of nature. And he kind of revels and he marvels in his own quirks. Now, Montaigne frequently corrected the essays. You can see this in front of you here. I think this is a page from the 1580 edition, and then you've got his annotations all around the margins in very small kind of text. And so, like I said, he spends nearly 20 years working, kind of reading, reflecting, producing the work for the essays. He begins writing the essays around the year 1572. So again, that's a year after he kind of officially retires. You're probably thinking retiring at 38, lucky him. The Apology for Raymond Sebon is a work that I wonder if I've got this on my slides. Yes, there it is. On the right, it's slightly blurry. So remember, his dad, before he dies, asked him to translate this work by Raymond Sebon on natural theology, and then Montaigne publishes the translation, but he also publishes a long introduction, explaining why it's not a heretical text and why it's interesting and useful. This is a really long work. In the essays, it's a huge part of it, like quantity-wise, but also in terms of the ideas, the Apology. This is written in 1576. The first two books published in 1580, as mentioned. All three books together, 1588. And then the first complete edition of the essays, 1595, after he died. And here are just some more, again, from these beautiful editions. And this is just another page of kind of how much, if we think about these essays as exercises in self-interrogation and self-examination, he continues this work after publication. He continues changing, amending, and so on. So why does Montaigne do it? There's a lovely line that you may have seen quote enough places already, but it comes from the essay Of Experience, about the way he views the study of himself as being like a science. "I study myself more than any other subject. That is my metaphysics. That is my physics." And so for historians of the self and subjectivity, I'm thinking of Charles Taylor. Montaigne is an interesting point. Samuel Pepys, I suppose, in a very different way, is another. Of a kind of wider drift in European society away from over concern about the soul and more direct concern with the self, the memories and the things that you experience being where you are, this being worthy of examination. Montaigne's style has had a lot of admirers. Hopefully you enjoyed the reading too. I'll give you a couple of quotes. So Flaubert describes Montaigne's style as basically like a fruit. A fruit that fills your mouth and throat, so, quote, so succulent that the juice goes right to your heart. And Ralph Waldo Emerson kind of similarly says, quote, "Wild and savoury as sweet fern, full of sincerity and marrow. Cut these words and they would bleed, they are vascular and alive." Maybe this is a key part of why people enjoy Montaigne's style, because there's so much of him there, and he's so good at presenting himself and examining himself, and we examine himself with him. And there isn't this over self-celebration there, it's something different. Alright, let's find out more about Montaigne's world. So, it's the 16th century. Now, I know not all of you on this course have got like a big history background, but we've also kind of discussed in our classes that it's really important to know a person's context, what's happening in their world. Now, a big thing that's happened in Montaigne's world. It's not happened in France, but it's kind of affected all of Europe, and it's this guy. It's Martin Luther, and it's the Reformation. So Martin Luther in 1517 posts 95 theses, 95 statements of criticism of the Catholic Church. At this point in time in Europe, there's one church only. That church is based in Rome. It has one ruler, the Pope, and he is infallible. And he has more power, and has a degree of power over the heads of state of Europe. But there's been a lot of concern about perceived corruption in the Catholic Church for a long time. On a basic level, monks, sometimes nuns, are often the subject of ridicule in literature, in what survives that we know of popular culture, for being corrupt, for eating and drinking and being merry, as Cohort of Ecclesiastes would have no problem with. But supposedly pious ascetic monks seems hypocritical, especially when people are paying so much of what little they managed to make towards the upkeep of monasteries in the church and tithes and so on. In places like Germany, where Martin Luther is, there's anger that more taxes are being raised in order to pay for the redecoration of the decoration. I think it's the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. These beautiful, splendiferous, golden, highly ornate places of worship, when people in Germany are very poor. And didn't Jesus Christ preach poverty and simplicity of life? Well, surely there's something gravely hypocritical about all this. So Martin Luther begins the Reformation. Now we think nowadays of Europe, Western Europe, Catholic countries, Protestant countries, we know that there's kind of a line, we could draw it somewhere across Northern Europe. Lots of Germany, but not all of it. The Netherlands, but not Belgium. The UK, Protestant, but to the south Catholic. Now France, at some point it could go either way. France is very divided, and this is one kind of quite gruesome image that kind of captures just a terrible event that happened. So different parts of the French nobility are divided on this. Some, like the House of Bourbon, are Calvinist, a Protestant. Others, like the House of Guise, are Catholic. So you have these kind of key aristocratic factions. And it's not just about a matter of conscience. This is also a matter about who next becomes king, and therefore what the official or what the de facto approved religion of the country is. Now, ever since the Reformation, there hadn't been any peaceful coexistence between Catholicism and Protestantism, simply because Protestantism poses, in some ways, an existential threat to the Catholics. There's a whole emphasis on vernacular worship in local languages that people can understand. The authority of the monks and the Pope is completely removed. Even some were calling for bishops to be significantly disempowered. Service is completely changed. No more bells and whistles. No more smoke. No more incense. No more stained glass. No more statues. No more images. A kind of an internal and introspective, studious kind of Christianity emerges. Now France is divided. There are the wars of religion in France. They kind of Actually, I think 9 wars from 1562 to 1598. And a shocking moment that happens in the midst of this St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which was in the image just earlier, which is, there's a kind of a plot really led by the Queen, the King's mother, Catherine de' Medici. I'll just bring her up. She's concerned that her son is becoming too influenced by Protestantism and Protestant ministers and so forth. She's Catholic, and so she and people associated with the House of Guise engineered this plot. Basically, there are wedding celebrations taking place in Paris in August 1572, and lots of prominent French Protestants, Huguenots they were called, are in Paris for these celebrations. They're not expecting to be attacked, but that's what happens. Suddenly, this one, I think the Admiral Coligny is murdered, and then soon, the kind of soldiers and then the public, or not all the public, but a lot of the public, began attacking and killing Huguenots. Thousands upon thousands are killed in a really horrific way. Conservative figures 5,000. But it's not just about what's happening in Paris in 1572, it's what's happening in France more widely. Think about the dates of Montaigne's essays here in relation to this. Huguenots end up being massacred across France. And this is a real turning point on one level, or you kind of British history buffs, you might be thinking about the Huguenots in London, Spitalfields, Huguenot refugees, Huguenot migration. This transforms English history, I suppose, because it leads to the arrival of many skilled merchants into England, and this helps England become a wealthier, more effective kind of country at producing skilled goods, which are then useful for trading with slaves later on. But not just that, it also goes to show that there can be no peace, and France ends up being divided in these different grounds. So keep that in mind with Montaigne's skepticism, his emphasis on suspending judgment, the ways in which some of his family members have turned to the Protestant side, but Montaigne's point is that human beings have believed everything. As in Ecclesiastes, everything under the sun. People have been caught up with all kinds of fads and strange beliefs. And Lutheranism is just the latest one. We should suspend judgment and respect traditions, and that is another key bit of Montaigne's politics. It's sometimes called fideism, faithism, an emphasis on faith and adherence to tradition being a more overarching good than intellectual cross-examination. And there will be bits of Montaigne that, for people that are more on the side of the Enlightenment, will be disappointed at. Quietism, don't question too much. Man should know his place. But there are other important things happening too in Montaigne's world. Let me just go through a few more contexts. So we're going to talk a bit about now the new worlds coming into view. And this map here, which is in the shape of a heart, and this is purposeful, was produced by a man called Aurelius in 1536. And he produces a number of heart-shaped maps, projection maps, over the early 16th century. And it kind of reflects this problem of how do you map a sphere? How do you map the different places? Now, Christopher Columbus, the West Indies have been discovered in the late 15th century. And we can see that here, kind of. But you'll see that North America, which is kind of on the top left, is just kind of goes straight into China, more or less. There's still knowledge of the world is still so incomplete. You've also got Australia on the bottom left. You might be thinking, I didn't know they got to Australia back then. They had not. What's interesting about Australia is that it's always a projection. It's always a supposition that there must be a huge landmass in the south, which kind of balances all the landmasses of the north. And so for centuries, there is an attempt to find Australia. They believe it exists, they just don't know how big it is. And so you'll see here, it's kind of, they portray it as quite large, but also connected to what we would now call Antarctica. The Mercator map, this is not such a great one, it's slightly grainy, is a more important innovation, 1569. It's the map that we still use today. And it's maps like this that are so important for navigation at sea, and we get that impression when we look at the presence of the sea here and the small little ships in different places, or even the kinds of routes that seem to be implied by the different lines. Navigation is happening, reaching the East Indies and the West Indies. And here is another map by Abraham Ortelius, Theatre of the World. Again, we're seeing it coming closer and closer to what we would understand. If you think about the Finney map of 1536, we've got this map, it's only 34 years later. America is now much more distinct. I mean, yet the continents are kind of not, America's huge and Latin America's quite small. But look, you might want to look at the detail even for Africa. More and more is becoming known at this point. And that's exciting. New worlds are becoming known about. This is the thing that I want you to keep in mind here. Now, some of these new worlds were surrounded by fear and prejudice. That's human nature. That's what Montaigne would tell us. There were stories, often quite exaggerated, from people that had travelled with the Spanish or the Portuguese to the new worlds, to Brazil, and had met Brazilians. And these stories often talked about their cannibalism, like you see in this image. The savagery. Now, there does seem to have been some cannibalism, I'm sure, but what these travellers' stories and then the way that they're reported afterwards do is they kind of exaggerate and embellish, so that cannibalism, rather than becoming a kind of a fairly, irregular practice, seems to be presented as a kind of, debauched way of life. And it's important. Think about the figures in this image here. Yes, they're human, but do they look as human as our European traveller at the very back, despairing with his hands in the air? Perhaps not. The bodies of the men is very furry. Nakedness. They've all got very similar kind of looking faces, the men and women. Not particularly flattering. Now, Montaigne, in a brilliant essay called Off Cannibals, talks about Brazilians, because he's very interested in them. He has a footman from Brazil, a servant, who he's able to kind of talk to, and he finds out more about what life was like for Brazilians. But it's more that some Brazilian tribesmen, the Tupinamba people, are brought over to the French port of Rouen. And Montaigne, I think for his footman, is able to ask them questions and interview them. And Montaigne does something that we will see later on. We'll see it more in the 18th century, like with Rousseau and others. He thinks that there's a lot of hypocrisy in the ways in which the Europeans view the new world and the peoples that they come into contact with, be they from Brazil or maybe from different parts of Africa. That maybe what the Europeans are doing as they land in the New World is more inhuman than the cannibalism that is so frequently reported. Moreover, you get a cultural relativism in Montaigne, that these are also human beings of nature, and that what we call barbarism just reflects our own judgments. And Montaigne then uses this to make an interesting refrain about how actually us modern French folk, are more barbaric than these people. You'll see the quote on the screen, I'll just read it. Each person calls barbarism whatever is not his or her own practice. We may call cannibals barbarians in respect to the rules of reason, but not in respect to ourselves, who surpass them in every kind of barbarity. Now, what barbarity is he talking about? Well, he reports a conversation with one of the Tupinamba in Rouen, who must have been given some sort of tour. And the Brazilian is shocked that, as he walks around, he meets some, like the king, like wealthy nobility, who have so much to eat, have got too much food, and live in great opulence. But then there are beggars on street corners. How can you have a society in which you have both extreme rich and extreme poor? And Montaigne presents this as one of the examples that makes France more barbaric than the kind of natural, simple equality that he associates and portrays with life in Brazil. He also makes this point about cannibalism. Montaigne thinks that cannibalism is actually okay. in certain circumstances, and that is, according to what Montaigne says, the only people that get eaten are prisoners of war. So it's sort of a tribute to the people that you defeat in battle. If those that you've not killed or have not died, you round them up and then you cook and eat them. And this is simply better than having them as prisoners or slaves, because it accords them a kind of respect. I mean, what's so fascinating about Montaigne is that he makes this kind of argument in the 16th century. No one else is. Instead, we have far more prejudice and bigotry. There's an influence on Shakespeare. Well, maybe there is. In Shakespeare's The Tempest, which some of you might know. So The Tempest, produced in 1610, one of Shakespeare's kind of slightly later plays. It's set on a remote island where a storm has just washed up a ship. And so on this island, you've got the sorcerer Prospero and his daughter Miranda, and he's got his two servants. Caliban is like a monster, and Ariel, I think she's a fairy. Now, on the island, there's this there is the possibility of retaking the Duchy of Milan, and you get this basically magic and romance and so on. And people look at The Tempest, and there's claims that it's a kind of a post-colonial story or fable, because Prospero, the sorcerer, ends up using magic. He has the possibility of using magic in order to kind of conquer and subjugate nature, to make man a master of nature, as the English philosopher Francis Bacon envisioned and encouraged. And Caliban is kind of like a slave in this process too. Now, when Gonzalo, one of the people that's been washed up on the island, is kind of talking about life on the island, he presents it in terms that's similar to what Montaigne has to say in Of Cannibals. And it's this idea that there is something that maybe is kind of pure about life there, because there is no law in Brazil. Remember, Montaigne, he's got his background in law himself, and he doesn't have much good to say about law in his writings, nor medicine for that matter. Now, Gonzalo kind of celebrates this world in which there is no need of law because people are naturally virtuous. Quote, "For no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate. Letters should not be known," it means like books. "Riches, poverty, and use of service, like servants, none. Contract, succession, born, bound of land, till, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn, or wine, or oil, no occupation, all men idle all. Treason, felony, sword, pike, knife, gun, or need of any engine would I not have." So it's a simpler, purer existence. This is the emphasis that Montaigne really makes in the essay Of Cannibals, which I highly recommend to you. Now, what else is happening in Montaigne's world at this point in time? Well, just as we have kind of new parts of the world, new bits of the map appearing, there are also new worlds appearing in telescopes and later microscopes. A new understanding of our place in the universe, or at least our place in the galaxy. The traditional view was that everything revolved around the Earth. The Earth was centered. This reflected, kind of God's ordainment of human superiority in nature. But then you have figures like Copernicus, illustrated here, Galileo Galilei, another, who challenged this. He said, hold on a minute, the sun surely must be the center. And this is based on a lot of observations and other things. But these are kind of scandalous ideas, they're dangerous ideas, because they undermine traditional church teachings. But influence grows, knowledge grows, and so another kind of pillar of religious infallibility crumbles. You've got the Reformation as one, and then you've got these kind of challenges that are happening to kind of knowledge, to science, that have been kind of cornerstones of the Christian worldview. Another, just briefly, comes from the figure Erasmus. Erasmus was a humanist scholar, a friend of Thomas More, who's in Wolf Hall and a very interesting philosopher, writes Utopia. What Erasmus does, he doesn't become a Protestant, although he's around at that time. He decides that he wants to produce the most textually accurate version of the New Testament that one could have. So because he's very gifted in Latin and Greek, he gets hold of an earlier kind of Greek version of the New Testament and he translates it into Latin. But what he discovers in the translation is that there is no mention of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. This is not present in the New Testament. This is just something that's kind of been passed down instead. And then he's concerned because this is a key part of Catholic doctrinal belief. And so he ends up putting it back in even though it's not there. So there are these challenges, basically. Another thing that's just important to note, that we're going to get to Montaigne in a second, is that lots of Greek philosophical texts are becoming available. Now, this reflects the fall of Constantinople, which happens, I think, in the 15th century. Previously the centre of the Byzantine Empire, Christian Empire. It becomes overrun by the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. Hereafter, the Ottoman Empire it becomes a major kind of power and threat in Europe. Now, the fall of Constantinople has all sorts of effects. One of them is that a lot of scholars who had been based there flee westwards. And they bring with them Greek texts, and they also bring with them the ability to translate them into Latin. And so a lot of philosophical texts become available from the 15th century onwards. This has an important bearing on Stoicism, which we'll get onto in a second. Before then, not much, maybe a bit of Seneca. It's all that people had of Stoicism in medieval Europe. But now with these new texts, new linguistic abilities, whole new understandings of philosophy are emerging. So it's a powerful brew. The wars of religion, contact with a new world, Greek philosophy, a new understanding of the universe. And then just to kind of the wider effects of this moment of incredible confidence in human reason. Because all of these remarkable inventions, the English philosopher Francis Bacon again talks about these kind of free breakthroughs. Paper, printing, literacy that comes with it, gunpowder, decisive in giving Europeans a military advantage over people they were coming into contact with, although smallpox would be probably the more decisive one, at least in terms of the subjugation of the Aztecs and the Incas. But then the magnet, why? For the compass, for navigation. So all of these major things are happening in Montaigne's world. And how do you position yourself within that? A part of how Montaigne's own position takes place when he's doing this work on the natural theology of Raymond Sebond. Now, Raymond Sebond was a Catalan scholar who dies in 1436, so I guess some time before Montaigne is translating this. And what Sebond does in natural theology, it's a kind of grey text in terms of is it heretical or not. He tries to demonstrate the existence of God through his physical creation or creations. And Sebond says that God's revelation takes place through two books. There's the Bible, book 1, but book 2 is the book of nature, the book of what physically exists. And so what we get in Sebond is this kind of marveling and love of nature. This interest in the animal world, this interest in a kind of harmony and beauty in nature which reflects something that's God-given. And we'll see this in the way that Montaigne talks about animals and talks about a kind of an interest in nature as a means of understanding God. Anyway, the book, the prologue of the book ends up getting placed on the Index of Prohibited Books in 1595. So at least through this work on Sebond, there is this interest in nature. There is a world of kind of remarkable new developments and new beliefs. And Montaigne's kind of positions himself in the middle of that. His own society, his own country is so divided. Massacres, bloodshed, families split in two. So how would you position yourself in a world like that? A world that has far more turmoil and far more kind of scientific and intellectual discovery than ours does nowadays. Well, these are the essays. This is what they do. Montaigne is thinking amidst these developments, thinking pragmatically. One of the things that he rejects in many places is theoretical knowledge, the knowledge of the scholastics, the schoolmen, that which was taught in universities. Often it was heavily reliant on Aristotle, but it was a kind of Christianized Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas was very influential here. Rather than learning from dusty old books, Montaigne and others are interested in the book of life. They're interested in observation. And so if there is a philosophy in Montaigne's essays, and it kind of is, it's about self-examination. It's about understanding your experience to develop a more balanced judgment. But also, as I mentioned earlier, this is also, the essays demonstrate his values, his way of life, who he is. And that's important too. One of the things that we've seen in the Stoic philosophers time and again is philosophy as a way of life. But with the essays, we have a journey on Montaigne's own way of life. Okay, right, in this next part 3, we are I'm just going to give you a little bit of background into what's happening with Stoic philosophy in early modern Europe. So the key figures for early modern Stoicism are Seneca and Epictetus. Marcus Aurelius, yes, but he is kind of translated into Latin later on, I think 16th or 17th century. Seneca, you can see him just on the left, is really decisive. There's already a lot of love and admiration for Seneca since the medieval period, because of this belief that Seneca had this correspondence with St. Paul. This is now believed not to not be true. Pseudo Seneca, it's not real Seneca. But there's kind of Seneca's safe because Seneca's one of us for the medieval Christians. He's not really, but there's always that thing there. Epictetus is enough. Epictetus is somebody whose work is kind of in part brought over by the exile of Greek scholars. But think for a moment about how we've done our course and the difficulties that we had in trying to reconstruct Stoic philosophy. Very little Greek Stoic text survived. Only quotes and bits and bobs by Zeno, by Chrysippus. Now, in early modern Europe, there is very little to work with. Some Seneca, not much. No Marcus. Epictetus only later. Now, with the fall of Constantinople, one of the texts that also becomes available is something that we read in our second week, which is The Lives of the Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius. A brilliant, useful resource. Epictetus is brought to in the 1430s. Now, a key figure for us is this guy, Justus Lipsius. Now, if this course were a bit longer, we would have a week specifically on him, on a work that he writes, De Constantia, on constancy. Now, Justus Lipsius he's kind of like his period of life it covers a similar time to Montaigne. It's slightly later. He's born in 1547 and he dies in 1606. Now, what Lipsius wanted to do was reconcile Stoic philosophy with Christianity. Now, Lipsius is able and he's using more and more Stoic texts. He produces these major editions of Seneca and also Tacitus. And he writes a few key works. There's On Constancy, which comes out in 1584. I'm not sure if Montaigne read it, but it's a similar time that the essay's being produced. But then later on, he produces like a guidebook or handbook on Stoic philosophy, and also a book on Stoic physics, both in the year 1604. Now, the key text for us is this one On Constancy that he writes when he's relatively young in 1584. And it's this guide about how to live. And it's written in this, it's very much influenced by Seneca, and there's a dialogue in there. It's really engaging, and it gets translated into different European languages really quickly. It's a big hit, and there's some quite interesting and beautiful lines in it. Let's just look at a couple. Quote: "You ask." This is where Lipsius is basically giving us. He decides that he's going to come up with his own epitaph. The thing that will be written on his tombstone. And so this is it. Quote: "You ask, who is buried here? I myself will tell you. In the past I spoke with both pen and tongue. Now just one of these will be permitted. I am Lipsius, whose fame has come from my writing and your favour. I mean, at this stage, he doesn't know he's going to be famous. But I have gone, and my fame too will go. This world possesses nothing lasting. May I speak with you in a loftier tone? All human affairs are smoke, shadow, and emptiness, a scene in a play, and in a word, nothing. These are my final words to you. Pray that I may rejoice in eternity. Now, this is a painting here by Rubens with Lipsius. I think he's the second from right. Now, if you look just above these, the image is called the Four Philosophers. See, it's kind of four men, looking over some books. Now, you might recognize the bust above them all. It's Seneca, and it points to the high regard for Seneca in this period. Remember, Seneca, it's not just these really engaging works of philosophy, it's also the dramas as well, really important for Shakespeare and others. Another quote from Lipsius. Just as rust is by its nature related to the iron it erodes, or the vermin and rot to the wood they gnaw, so animals, cities, and kingdoms carry their own internal causes of annihilation. Look at the heavenly bodies and the lower realms, at things great and small, at the products of the hand or of the mind. They have always fallen into ruin and will continue to do so for eternity. And as rivers, remember rivers are a really important image for us on this course. As rivers are led to the sea with a continuous and swift course, so all human affairs slide down to their end by this, so to speak, channel of destruction. The end is death and ruin, of which plague, wars, and massacres are the servants and instruments. If death is inevitable for them, so too in this respect is destruction. From the beginning, an eternal law has been imposed on this world, to be born and to die, to come into being and to pass away. You might be thinking here of resonances with Hamlet. This would be an important comparison to keep in mind. This is a law of nature. All beings are born and die. It's interesting to kind of think about what this would mean for a Christian worldview, because there was that bit earlier about, thinking about eternity and so on. But Lipsius was deliberately trying to take key Stoic beliefs and understandings of nature and present them in an early modern way, in an engaging way for the public. And so what you get with that, immediately is this kind of sense that life is short, that we are matter. And it's not such a big leap to say, well, if our bodies die and disappear, then what do we really know about our souls? To what extent is the immortal soul something that our reason can actually intuit and understand? Or is that just yet another supposition? The more kind of myths of the temples, which the Greek and Roman Stoics seem to suggest we should pay tribute to, but not really believe with any kind of real, depth of faith whatsoever. I want to show you this. You might have actually seen this in person. This is from St. Bartholomew the Great Church in London, in Smithfield. It's a beautiful mural. Now, I'm not going to expect that you can read Latin, but if you just look down to the bottom, behold yourselves by us, such once were we as you, and you in time shall be, even dust as we are now. 1588. So what we get in early modern Europe is and this is kind of spearheaded by Justus Lipsius, but then Montaigne is another important part of this, even though he's not officially Stoic, is a kind of revival of Stoicism. Seneca, Epictetus, Lipsius, but then you have figures like Pierre Charon, Guillaume de Vere, basically who are kind of popularising Stoic ideas and Stoic teachings. This is just, those are just French examples, but there are others in England and in other places too. It also appears in philosophy. On the right, Descartes. On the left, a drawing of Pascal. Both important mathematicians, both making the case for a kind of unconventional Catholicism in France at that time. Now, both were also influenced by Stoic ideas in different ways. Descartes draws a lot on Seneca when he is producing this, when he's writing letters to Princess Elizabeth on the emotions. This ends up becoming kind of collected as a kind of a late work, and it ends up having an influence on Spinoza. We'll talk about Spinoza next week. Descartes says, you tell me, I think this sounds quite Stoic. Quote, happiness consists solely in contentment of mind. In order to achieve a contentment which is solid, we need to pursue virtue. That is to say, to maintain a firm and constant will to bring about everything we judge to be best. Virtue, firm and constant will, the contentment of mind. For Pascal, Epictetus is an important figure. Pascal liked this image that we talked about when we looked at Epictetus' handbook about everything that we care about and value, our loved ones, being something that is given on loan, and so we have to give it back at the end, and we've got to submit to this. But Epictetus didn't like, and this would become a problem for our early modern Stoics, that these heathens seem to have what Pascal calls a wickedly proud belief in human autonomy, or at least in terms of the autonomy or power of our reason. There isn't this kind of grave submission to faith and belief that is necessary. And they also have an unflinching determinism, a belief in fate that we talked about last week with Chrysippus and what he had to say about fate. And so you could be called, if your beliefs were kind of deterministic, you could be accused of being a Stoic in this period. This might be slightly dangerous. It might mean that you're a bit ungodly. So Thomas Hobbes is called a Stoic by enough contemporary Bramhall because of the apparent determinism of what he thought. So what does it mean to be a Stoic then in this period? Determinism is an important part of that. If you're thinking, what do I mean here? It's basically not putting everything down to free will. And free will is so important in the Christian tradition. Making a choice, having a Damascene moment, having a conversion, changing your life. The Stoics don't really believe that at all, and not in a conventional way. Yes, you can train your mind and you will therefore make hopefully better decisions, or you'll be less disturbed by things that happen to you. But you don't really have that much agency at all over what happens to you or what happens in your soul. Stoicism then as now is as much about accepting what happens as trying to modify it, maybe even more just about accepting. But what we get with Lipsius and others is what's sometimes called neo-Stoicism. It's basically Christian Stoicism, where there still is this kind of submission to God at the end. They take the stuff about providence, which some of us were not sure about in Epictetus, and they inject Christianity into that. You'd get some philosophers who would use Stoicism in a political way as well, in terms of looking at human beings and human society in terms of our nature, in terms of natural law, in terms of a state of nature, in terms of what it means to be human beings by nature, which might all sound really basic and obvious, but which wasn't obvious at all, because political theory that existed in early modern Europe before the influence of the Stoics, is kind of reliant on, I guess, Augustine, City of God, Aquinas. It's a kind of view that politics is about virtue and it's about godliness, and it usually involved a kind of an association of the sovereign with God. And it would give far too much credence to the benevolence of rulers than perhaps what we would accept nowadays. And certainly, if we look at human beings by nature, having desires, emotions, and needs, then suddenly that changes the way we think about the purpose of politics. What you also get is this, well, among some people at least, this idea that all religions could be near the mark. That they all reflect some broad truths about God. Anyway, so this is some kind of common things. Right, you're probably thinking, come on, get to Montaigne. Let's get to Montaigne. So in this bit I want to talk a bit about, we're going to focus on Montaigne's essay of experience. So Montaigne has two major influences that come up in the essays. Cicero is an important figure for him. And Sextus Empiricus is another. We'll talk about Sextus Empiricus in a moment. He's associated with a skeptic philosophy, skepticism. I said 2, but actually there's 3. In fact, there's one that's just way more important, and that's this guy. Hopefully you'll recognize this man. Very important for the Stoics, it's Socrates. Remember Zeno of Citium, survived a shipwreck, is in a bookseller's, and he hears about the life and thought of Socrates, and he wants to study under somebody who can get him as close to that as possible, and that leads him to the Cynics, the Cynic philosophy. The Stoics often saw themselves as the successors to Socrates because what they envision philosophy being is a way of life, a form of interrogation and evaluation. Something that involves an ethics at the centre, in a way that you just don't get at all in other traditions. You don't, as much as there is an ethics in Aristotle, this whole emphasis on how you live with this. Seneca talks about the importance of philosophy being about how you live, not just the study of words. We saw this in Epictetus as well. Now, in a few different points in Montaigne's work, we see this idealization of Socrates in different ways. And Socrates says this in one place. This is from the Apology for Raymond Seaborn, which is like a justification for Raymond Seaborn's ideas. He says, well, I am ignorant. I think it's Socrates here. Socrates, who never wrote, who described himself as a midwife of other people's ideas. Montaigne presents himself in the same way. Quote, "It is from my own experience that I emphasize human ignorance, which is, in my judgment, the most certain faction in the school of the world. Those who will not be convinced of their ignorance by so vain an example as me or themselves, let them acknowledge it through Socrates." And so Socrates kind of comes up again and again. Actually, I don't think this quote is from the Apology to Raymond Seaborn. I think this is from the essay Off Experience that we're doing. Sorry. And so this comes up in other points too, in Off Experience, about what it means then to kind of follow Socrates' example and to understand nature and understand ourselves in accordance with nature. Notice the repetition of ignorance here. Quote, "I, unconcerned and ignorant within this universe, allow myself to be governed by this world's general law, which I shall know sufficiently when I feel it. No knowledge of mine will bring it to change its course. It will not take a different road for my sake. It is madness to wish it to, greater madness to be upset by that fact, since such law is of necessity unvarying, generic, and applied to all." I'm going to be, over this next bit, I'm going to be inviting you to kind of make contrasts with Stoic philosophy in different points. I think there are resonances there, aren't there? Seeing ourselves in the wider scope of nature being consistent and universal, submitting to nature, having our will in harmony with nature. Let's say a bit more about Montaigne's Stoicism. There's a lovely essay that he writes, "To philosophize is to learn how to die." Highly recommend it. And this is many places in which Socrates appears. Socrates is important. Because Socrates, at least in the ways in which Plato records his final moments, his final scenes, like in works like the Apology, Socrates talks about philosophy being a training for dying, a preparation for death. Not just in a gloomy or morose way, but in a way of being able to kind of kindle and discover what really matters to us. Now, Montaigne presents himself as a skeptic. I promise you we'll get there to that in a moment. But he was often seen as being a Stoic in his time and after. The emphasis on understanding nature, but also understanding our own natures. To live naturally, live in accordance with nature. Here's a quote from Off Experience. "Nothing is so beautiful, so right, as acting as a man should. Nor is any learning so arduous as knowing how to live this life naturally and well." So this is Off Experience is largely about that, of his experience and of the value of experience in general. Not just in a facile sense that with age comes wisdom. Experience doesn't make us wise. It's how we interrogate and examine experiences that we've had. That's the important thing. And Off Experience, this is kind of examination and statement, I suppose, of his own philosophy, of examining his life, of presenting himself, as Cromwell would say, warts and all, flaws and all, to look at himself as a mind and as a body in all of his failings. There's something to learn from as a creature of nature. There are some often really valuable and useful moments in off experience. I'm not going to exhaustively quote all of it. I hope you found this essay thrilling. But we get this kind of emphasis in places on what it would mean to live well, to live fittingly in accordance with nature. Let me just quote enough a bit. What great fools we are. He has spent his life in idleness, we say. I haven't done a thing today. Why? Have you not lived? That is not only the most basic of your employments, it is the most glorious. I would have shown them what I can do if they had set me to manage some great affair. If you'd been able to examine and manage your own life, you have achieved the greatest task of all. Nature, to display and show her powers, needs no great destiny. She reveals herself equally at any level of life, both behind curtains or without them. Our duty is to bring order to our morals, not to the materials for a book, not to win provinces in battle, but order and tranquility for the conduct of our life. Our most great and glorious achievement is to live our life fittingly. There are moments like that which we could kind of, if we had like a Stoic scrapbook, I think we should cut out and paste. That this philosophy is about how we live and how we live well. That's a very important strand of Seneca's thinking. But let's start looking at the ways in which Montaigne isn't quite Stoic. Am I going to do this? Oh, no. Okay, I covered some of this already. Okay, let's just say, let me just see if there's anything that I should also try and cover here. I guess so in this essay too, there's a lot of discussion of law and then medicine. We know that Montaigne is very critical of doctors. He's obviously had a lot of bad experiences. He talks a lot about having kidney stones. His father also had very painful kidney stones. For Montaigne, there's a lot of foreboding that just as he saw his father in great pain, Montaigne also believed that he would possibly die young from the stone as well. It's kind of pleasantly surprised that he doesn't. And he writes a lot about how he manages the pain. And how even living with chronic pain, there are these kind of moments of reprieve or moments of blessing in which the stone literally passes out of you. And the kind of the relaxation that comes afterwards. A lot of this is about the body, isn't it? Montaigne makes these swipes at people that elevate the mind over the body. But if we're going to examine and understand ourselves, it can't just be in a kind of very sort of pious Christian way in terms of our soul. It's about what we feel, what we love, what we value. But also things that we might want to conceal. Farting, sex. Quotes like this, and upon the highest throne in the world we are seated still upon our arses. Even lady shit is one of the many memorable lines from this. And Montaigne's kind of broader point is that we are all of nature. And so as much as it is human to kind of hide certain parts of our nature, yet still, if we're to understand ourselves as beings of nature, then we need to recognize what we are. We are animals. This is the human animal. But with the human animal comes, great and wondrous things too. And maybe like in the Book of Ecclesiastes, there still is an important kind of case for reason and understanding and wisdom here. Wisdom being self-examination. Okay, so I wasn't meant to do that bit. I'm now meant to kind of tell you about how this might not be so stoical. And to do this, we're going to look at the Apology, which I mentioned earlier. You can get it as a separate penguin because it's edition because it's so bloody long. It's good though. It's good. It's got some really beautiful things to say about animals. Now, what you get in this essay is this kind of something that is shaped by the French wars of religion, which is a kind of worry about the dangers of giving up on traditions and orthodox beliefs in favour of things that are still not well understood. And so we get here, and we get this in other places, that actually human beings reach very different judgments. it's far more likely that we're going to disagree on kind of core beliefs. Even observing something that we both might have seen together a few days ago, we'll have completely different perspectives and different takes. Think about the relativism of life in Brazil versus life in France. We differ so much in our opinions, in what matters to us. How then can we speak in sweeping and universal terms about what nature is, about what human beings are, what they should be? Montaigne is worried. And so we get in parts of this essay a kind of anti-science, an anti-scientism in favour of kind of falling back on tradition. Quote, "The goodness and sway of the ruler," and he means ruler like God, "should purely and utterly free us from any weight of anxiety about his rule. Scientific investigations and inquiries serve merely to feed our curiosity. They have nothing to do with knowledge so sublime. The philosophers are very right to refer us to the laws of nature, but they pervert them and present nature's face too sophistically, painted in colours which are far too exalted." And then he says later, "I would rather be an expert on me than on Cicero." When he's kind of expounding these beliefs, Montaigne turns to Sextus Empiricus. Sextus was a skeptical philosopher around in the 2nd century AD, CE. And what he does is he's not an originator of skeptical philosophy. This is normally associated with Pyrrho, and therefore Pyrrhonism. Now, skepticism isn't just about kind of critiquing or deconstructing other people's ideas. It's about a suspension of judgment. It's about recognizing that there are often equal claims to the truth, and what the reasonable person should do is understand these claims, but to withhold their judgment from them. Something's called equipollence. Now, Sextus is one of these texts that's brought over from Constantinople, and then it gets translated into Latin a bit later on. And what's interesting is that it's kind of presented to Europe as an antidote to Protestantism. It's funny, isn't it? Because we might think with skeptical philosophy that this is something that might undermine faith in God in different ways. But instead, it's used to undermine Martin Luther, to undermine Protestantism in different ways. And so in the Apology, you get this, Montaigne kind of presents in a few different places the advantages of thinking like Pyrrho. That Pyrrho tells us that human beings are unreliable, we're vainglorious. Quote, "The natural original distemper of man is presumption. Man is the most blighted and frail of all creatures, and moreover the most given to pride." And so what he does in the Apologies, he spends a long time talking about how horses and dogs and bees have got more sophisticated societies. They're more loyal, they're more friendly, they're more kind, they're more good than human beings are. And it's part of this kind of wider effort to kind of show that human judgment is frail. Human beliefs are often daft, aren't they? Think about coronavirus and 5G. And so when he's presenting the advantages of Pyrrho and skeptics, I'll give you another quick quote. He says that those who are quite sure that human strength is incapable of reaching truth are overbold and vain. These are the people that he agrees with, basically. The best thing we can do is be like Socrates then. All that I know is that I know nothing. So this is how we should think of Montaigne's skepticism. It's certainly not skepticism about God. It's in favour of tradition. And so it's about suspending judgment so that we don't get too persuaded by Huguenots and so on. There's a kind of relativism here. There's a kind of sense that human beings have all sorts of exotic and different customs. And this is almost, what reflects us in nature. That philosophical and scientific beliefs change over time. Therefore, we shouldn't be too excited about the latest beliefs because they'll just be overturned significantly in the future. The natural world is superior, and the cultural relativism that I've been talking about. Yeah, so there's lots of interesting moments here. And it has this interesting kind of effect, like what do we do with this skepticism And how is it that Montaigne kind of uses this in a fideistic and a faith-based way? Like here in the Apology. Quote, conclude there is no permanent existence either in our being or in that of objects. Now again, we might think here, this could easily lead to a kind of Stoic materialism. There is no immortal soul. Everything is body. It's interesting that Montaigne doesn't quite go so far as that. He continues, quote, we ourselves are faculty of judgment and all mortal things are flowing and rolling ceaselessly. I mean, what's that? Flowing and rolling ceaselessly. We heard Chrysippus, the Greek Stoic, saying all sorts of things like this. We've talked again and again about rivers and water and flow and Heraclitus and so on. The quote continues, nothing certain can be established about one from the other, since both judged and judging are ever shifting and changing. Okay, so in this final bit, I thought we could just talk, I guess, quite briefly about Shakespeare's play Hamlet, because, and I could be completely wrong in making this link, well, there is this whole question about did Montaigne influence Shakespeare because of these early translations that Shakespeare might have read? Or is it that they're just simply from the same cultural milieu? But then the way that I want to present them here is two important and very interesting, beautiful writers who are challenging some of the Stoic presumptions about how easily and how readily human reason can understand nature and therefore have some sense of control or agency within it. There's more skepticism here. There's a kind of skepticism about the powers of reason, powers of life in Hamlet too. So I've probably given you masses to read this week, so I think I was quite optimistic telling you last week that you should read or watch it alongside this, but if you did, great. Probably you'll know the story of Hamlet, but let's just kind of, what's it about? So Hamlet, it's produced over a couple of years. It's kind of written and then it's kind of rewritten a little bit later, 1599 to 1601. And it's about Prince Hamlet and his struggle for revenge against his uncle Claudius, who has murdered his father, also called Hamlet, who's the king of Denmark, and married his mother Gertrude. And Hamlet is kind of struggling with what to do, struggling to understand what's happened, struggling with the motivation to murder his uncle, which he doesn't want to do. And there's a lot of kind of self-doubt, maybe it's self-examination, but there's a lot of kind of despondency too. There's madness and melancholy in this work. Hamlet often converses with a ghost. He deliberately pretends to be mad in order to investigate whether his uncle might have secretly been involved in this plot. He puts on an antic disposition. And there's a lot of memorable soliloquies on human mortality, on what it means to live, and whether it would be better not to live. We'll come to that famous one in a moment. But there's another line that's kind of interesting, another kind of soliloquy, a bit shorter, known by its first part, what a piece of work is man. And here you've got this kind of outline of Stoic ideas, but then a kind of a pulling back away too. Quote, what a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me, no, nor women neither. Think of those lines from St. Bartholomew the Great. What it means to be dust. And what we do with that. This might be reminiscent of Marcus. Of recognizing our own mortality as a stumbling block to posterity. Maybe it's a form of relief. But in Hamlet, there's this kind of despair or melancholy. Life doesn't matter. The things that we value are easily taken away. It's more like the despair of Ecclesiastes, perhaps in points of Kohelet, the narrator. Now, this particular bit I've just read is sometimes thought to be something that shows a more direct influence of Montaigne. So Montaigne, in the Florio translation, which is his early translation into English, says, who have persuaded man that this admirable moving of heaven's vaults, that the eternal light of these lamps, so fiercely rolling over his head, that the horror-moving and continual motion of this infinite vast ocean were established, and continue so many ages for his commodity and service? Is it possible to imagine so ridiculous as this miserable and wretched creature, which is not so much as master of himself, exposed and subject to offences of all things, and yet dareth call himself master and emperor? Maybe there is that kind of melancholy about the limits of the power of reason in the famous bit of Hamlet, the to be or not to be speech. I won't read all that out. But there's just an interesting moment in this soliloquy, to be or not to be, later on, where Hamlet is talking about the limitations of human knowledge and the fear of death, and the power of the fear of death. And how the fear of death enables us to kind of tolerate things which should otherwise be intolerable. Quote, "There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make," quietus is like the kind of final word, final on a legal judgment, "when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin, like an arrow, like a final line. Who would fardels bear," I think these are camels, like camels that carry heavy loads. "Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have, than fly to others that we know not of. For us conscience does make cowards of us all." This last line you will have heard a lot. The thing that I want to kind of pick out there is this kind of the power of the fear of death, the dread of something after death. This is kind of reminiscent, maybe not so much of our Stoics, but of Epicurus and Lucretius. That it's the fear of death and the fear of the thereafter that prevents us from acting. So at least in this to be or not to be kind of speech, Hamlet just sees life as an endless series of suffering. You know, we can imagine something like this in the Dhammapada. You know, the endless cycles of life. Life is endless suffering and misfortune. At least death, you're doing something about it, you're getting it out of the way. But we don't know what will come after, and at least in Christian early modern Europe, suicide equals hell. There's the rub, there's the obstacle. So it's this fear of death which has great power and hold over us. Epicurus, when he presents these arguments, talks about it in terms of superstition and how religious authorities control our minds, because we're afraid of what happens after we die. So therefore we keep paying, giving our goods away for sacrifices and tributes and so on. But maybe what we get, which is different in Hamlet to, I don't know, Seneca or like a classic Stoic, is this idea that being morally worthy or just isn't always enough. That the passions overtake us, that fate trips us up, that human suffering sometimes wins out over our judgments. That sometimes in adversity, like in Greek tragedy, terrible things will happen and we end up doing some bad things too. Moral degradation is inevitable. The Greek, at least the Greek Stoic idea of the sage, of the wise person who kind of floats above all of it, is passion free. This doesn't seem to be possible for the Prince of Denmark, Hamlet. Maybe for some of the other characters like Horatio, but for Hamlet it's much more difficult. Maybe there's a kind of anti-Stoic, a challenge to Stoicism here that we've come across at different points. The perfection is too perfect. And here in Hamlet and in Montaigne, we have figures that are kind of challenging this Stoic tradition in different ways. Okay, right, let's start rounding up. So I think one thing that makes Montaigne wonderful is this kind of self-examination, the exploration of the self. Montaigne says, quote, "I set forth notions that are human and my own, simply as human notions considered in themselves, not as determined and decreed by a heavenly ordinance." He's just dealing with the authority of himself, of his own subjectivity. There's also the irreverent style too, the ways in which he talks about his own life or other people's lives. He can be quite funny in places. Another example. This isn't from off experience. "A French gentleman was always wont to blow his nose with his fingers, And he, justifying himself for so doing, asked me, what privilege this filthy excrement had, that we must carry about us a fine handkerchief to receive it, and carry it all day about in our pockets. I found that what he said was not altogether without reason. This is it. Montaigne's got this power to make us smart, hasn't he? To challenge our everyday presuppositions, to marvel at experience, to not reach kind of firm and hasty conclusions about them. And his interest in his own passions, rather than an attempt to live ascetically and to, overcome the passions. This overcoming that seems to be implied in the Buddha and seems to be implied by what survives of Xenoicism. Montaigne is totally different. Quote, I would rather produce my passions than brood over them at my expense. They grow languid when they have vent and expression. It is better that their point should operate outwardly than be turned against us. And there's all sorts of other wonderful things. He talks about his cats and so on like this. There's a lot of love of life in Montaigne. Joy in life. Real joy. Not philosophical, floating above the earth joy. This is joy in the here and now. Even surprisingly, Friedrich Nietzsche is an admirer of Montaigne. He says, quote, the fact that such a man has written truly adds to the joy of living on this earth. I hope you agree. Oh, okay, right. So our questions when we meet on Monday are this. What characterizes Montaigne's style and approach? I'm just interested to kind of find out how you found the essays. I've given you a lot more to read this week than previous weeks. What did you think of that style, and what do you think it tells us? Then I want us to get into a bit more detail on what the value of experience is as presented in the essay Of Experience. And then help me out with this, because I'm still not sure. Does Montaigne reinforce Stoic thinking? Could he be considered a kind of Stoic, or does he jeopardize the Stoic project? Same with Hamlet. We'll talk about all this between 1 and 3. And then for next week, Spinoza. Spinoza, my saint. So Spinoza is often associated with Stoic ideas, although he does criticize the Stoics in some places. Spinoza was a 17th century philosopher, interested in metaphysics, also a lens grinder. His view of God undermines a lot of basic Christian ideas. Now, while Spinoza dismisses the Stoics, there's a lot in his thinking that is kind of Stoic, or at least resonates with it. The equivocation of God or nature, this idea of looking at the universe from the perspective of eternity, subspecie aeternitas. There's Spinoza's determinism, the emphasis on the mind's power to understand nature. Now, the passions, or the affects as he calls them, are really important, but Spinoza doesn't believe that we can just conquer the passions with our own minds. He thinks this is impossible. This is a mistake of the Stoics. So we're going to look at Spinoza in relation to Stoicism and the ways in which Spinoza challenges, maybe improves the Stoic proposition. 2 readings for you. The first is just the first part. It's a short bit from the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, which he writes when he's quite young. And it's basically him setting out his philosophy. It's written in quite a personal way. It's just beautiful writing. And then we're going to look at part 4 of the Ethics. The Ethics is a hard book to just read as an excerpt. But in part 4, this is where Spinoza presents his understanding of the affects, the emotions, in terms of freedom and servitude. And he talks about how we're going to free our mind from the servitude of the passions, which sounds very Stoic. We're going to look at this and debate this. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much.